Hi, my name is Jonathan Freeman, Director of Photography of Defending Jacob, Game of Thrones, and Boardwalk Empire, and you're listening to the Go Creative Show.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Consoli. I am a director and owner of BC Media Productions, and this is the Go Creative Show, podcast for filmmakers. So today we're talking with Jonathan Freeman. He is the Director of Photography of Defending Jacob on Apple TV Plus and the cinematographer on a bunch of shows. We talk a lot about his work on Game of Thrones, including the scandal of the Starbucks coffee cup. What happened? How did it end up in the shot? We get to the bottom of it. We talk about that later in the show. And he also talks about kind of how he interprets scripts. You know, what is his process when he gets a script? How does he plan his shots? And his approach to a series being more of like an 8-hour movie instead of individual episodes. So there's a lot here, and you guys are going to absolutely love it, as always. Of course, I want to encourage you to subscribe to us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and of course, your favorite podcast app so that you never miss an episode and you can get your weekly dose of Go Creative Show. Let's dive into our interview with Jonathan Freeman, the Director of Photography for Defending Jacob. So I'm here with Jonathan Freeman, Director of Photography of Defending Jacob on Apple TV Plus, and a whole bunch more. Game of Thrones, Hollywoodland, Boardwalk Empire. If you've been watching TV anytime in the past, decade, you've seen his work. And we're going to talk a lot about it. Welcome, Jonathan, to the show.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate it.
So Defending Jacob is getting quite a bit of buzz. I believe that you were on the cover of either Entertainment Weekly or Variety. Not you personally, but the show itself. And it looks great, well acted, really nice story. I mean, this is a great project. And being on Apple TV Plus, I think it's getting a lot of attention because, you know, Apple TV Plus doesn't have the catalog of content like Netflix or Hulu does. Give us a little bit of insight into how you got involved in the show in the first place.
Morton Tildum, who's our director, who directed all 8 episodes, and we worked together actually a number of years ago on a commercial, and I was sort of talked about the idea of maybe working together at some point. I guess a couple of years ago, he found this project with Mark Baumbach, who's the writer, and they further developed it. I believe they got Chris Evans involved fairly soon afterwards, and eventually came to be ready for production. And Martin reached out to me to see if I was interested, and I read all the scripts. I was totally blown away. It was very, very gripping reading page to page. It was literally I read. I think I literally read all of them in one sitting.
Wow,
it was so good.
What do you look for when you get these scripts? Like, you know, I'm sure that people are handing you scripts all the time. You're kind of deciding what projects you're going to take on. Like, what are the things you look for in a script that make you feel confident that this is the right show for you?
You know, I obviously, as a cinematographer, I'm always compelled for scripts that might be very visual. However, I must say that the most important thing for me is the quality of the writing of the scripts. And that is the story, that is the characterization, that's the dialogue. And even though I have absolutely nothing to do with any of that other than telling the story, it really is important for me to be a part of feeling that I'm helping to contribute to a really strong story. If the story is weak, yes, it could be visually beautiful, but for me, it's kind of sort of a hollow prize in some way. So it's really, really important that the writing is strong and the content is really strong.
What are some of the things that like people may not know about these scripts when you get them? Like, I think some people in our audience, you know, have not had this opportunity where they're being handed a script for something of that level and they have to kind of interpret it from cinematography standpoint. Like, are there notes in the script that are indicating certain cinematography techniques? Are there any references in there? What may surprise people about what is actually in these scripts for a cinematographer?
A lot of scripts don't necessarily have descriptive detail per se, certainly maybe specifically related to cinematography. Some scripts do, and it would depend on the writer and the story that's being told. Some scripts require more visual detail written into them. But most all scripts do tend to be pretty stripped bare of that. I think partially because when a director is first reading a script, they don't want literally the writer dictating what the shot should be, for example. So I think they're generally careful not to go too heavy on that. Occasionally, they use more obscure descriptions like "we pull back" or "we widen out," or just to get an understanding that the writer's hope is that somehow we start in a detail and we eventually reveal where we are. So that's sort of nuance in the writing is helpful, but it doesn't specify exactly how to cover things. And of course, it's also open for interpretation once the director and cinematographer get on board.
Sure. Now, you have the same director throughout all the episodes. Am I right about that? Did you say that earlier in the?
Yes.
Okay. Now that must be refreshing to have one director that you're working with for the entire series, because a lot of these series, things will be done in blocks where there's one director that does 2 episodes. And then you go to the next director, and you're constantly kind of switching between your crew almost. Not your crew, but your directors. Is there something nice about having consistency across all the episodes?
It's an absolute great experience to be able to work with, a single director with their single vision. And essentially it is like shooting a very long movie.
Yeah.
Which also makes it a little bit more challenging in terms of keeping everything as sharp as you can, because it's a lot of material to try and deliver, and to be able to feel fresh as much as you can all the way through it. That's easier in a movie because you basically have maybe 2 hours of material to deal with. Here we had 8 hours, and you need to also keep the momentum of the story going. So that's firstly going to be the importance of doing that. Importance of keeping the momentum is going to be based on how successful the scripts are to keep you going, keep you turning the page. And for us, as the visual side of the filmmaking, we have to do the same thing essentially.
Prior to your work on Defending Jacob, you've done multiple episodes of Boardwalk Empire, Game of Thrones. You did episodes of Rome. These are all highly stylized, basically period pieces in a way. I mean, a Game of Thrones is obviously fantasy, but there's still like a very distinct time period that you're emulating. Highly stylized. Defending Jacob is, pretty much regular life. I mean, it's realism. It's a completely different approach to filmmaking, I'm assuming. But I'd love to know kind of the comparisons between the work that you've done in Game of Thrones or Boardwalk Empire, and maybe how those experiences informed your work on Defending Jacob.
Actually, for me, I was actually kind of excited to do a contemporary film for once. The last one I did was quite a number of years ago. I've been basically shooting Game of Thrones and Boardwalk Empire for the last 10 years. That's been the bulk of my production work. And of course, those are extravagant period style pieces.
Yeah.
So for me to finally actually do a contemporary piece was, I almost had to reset my way of thinking slightly. I mean, it was the first time I'd seen a fridge on set in 10 years. It's like, so, okay, well, how do I deal with that? So, and the approach, I must say that I do try and take a similar approach to both. I don't just because something's period or something's
contemporary.
Contemporary. I still take the similar approach in the sense that for me, lighting needs to serve a few different things, but the most important thing is it has to serve the story. So you always have to start with how, when you light a scene, how it is going to convey a mood without dominating the scene. And it's really, really kind of critical for me that the cinematography never dominates the storytelling, and particularly on a production like Defending Jacob, where performances are the absolute key to the storytelling. You want to make sure that the cinematography is only supportive of that. And there's a lot of different ways, lighting and camera. I myself and Morton wanted to employ to try and support that.
Like what? Like, let's, for example, you said the refrigerator. Okay, so you are in a home. You're just interior, daytime. We're inside. Jacob's house, let's say. Mm-hmm. How are you approaching that to give you the realism that you're looking for in this contemporary time?
The key thing for me always is that at least in lighting, that the lighting comes from at least a sense of naturalism, in that sense that the light should feel like it's coming from some natural source, whether it's literally the light coming through the windows, or a practical light source in the room, or what have you, the reflective light that's bouncing off a wall. All those things are the key components for the building blocks of how I would light a scene. Now, that is pretty much standard for most cinematographers, and so I'm not doing anything unique, but it is helpful for me to understand every scene. The first question I ask is really, what is the mood? And the mood, of course, can be interpreted different ways, but a moody day interior might not have any sunlight coming through the windows, for example. Yeah, it could still have sunlight coming through windows if it's lit in a certain way, or there's a certain amount of contrast, and it is juxtaposed to another scene prior to it, or the scene that's going to advance or come right after it. So all those things are considered when I approach lighting for a scene. The second thing that will be important is, how the blocking will work within any kind of lighting plan. So I have a general idea of the way I like to approach a scene tonally, but I will need to make the adjustment based on how the actors walk through the space and land at certain points, so that I can keep the lighting consistent when we get the coverage. So if we have a wide scene of a kitchen, and Andy's character walks from the sink to the table and stops at the table, I have to consider, like, how am I going to light him in that section of the kitchen? Yeah. And so I have to, obviously think about that beforehand, before we start shooting, that when he lands here, I'm either going to need some practical light source, or I'm going to need to let the light fall off. If dramatically we want him to be more in silhouette, for example. So those are simple choices that are made throughout, but sometimes I will come up with ideas for lighting that happen before the blocking, and in the end, I either have to alter those plans because the blocking is different than what I imagined. And the most important thing for myself and Morton was to make sure that actors had the freedom, or at least the freedom to feel that they could move through the space the way their characters would.
Yeah.
And occasionally, I mean, what's great about our actors was not only how brilliant they were in terms of their performance, but their ability to adapt to help tell the story visually. So sometimes Morton would want to reblock certain angles or certain actions for the characters, and the actors were very compliant and very helpful for both of us.
I can imagine. I mean, with a cast like that, Apple's spending some money on their cast and their productions, obviously, but there must be something kind of exciting too, just of like starting with a new network. I mean, obviously it's a new network, it's a new production house. It's obviously Apple, so it's established name, but it's still something kind of new. There has to be something fun about that, because you know, Defending Jacob is one of the earlier shows. There's only a handful on there.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that was exciting about that, is that, you know, Apple, again, because their preference is to make sure that the productions are of a quality that I think represents their company, and so they are, you know, very mindful of finding the right content, finding the right talent to make the content for them, and they're very supportive of the people that they ultimately hire to develop and create their productions. And I know I felt very supported of Apple, as I believe Morton did, and they understand that in order to be not different for the sake of being different, but different because it's good storytelling, that you have to take some risks. And I think they were very supportive of a lot of our choices, and that as an artist is a great place to be.
Now, Defending Jacob was filmed in Boston, which is right in our backyard here at Go Creative Show and BC Media Productions. We're just outside of the city. And there was so much talk around town, like, oh my God, there's a new Chris Evans project shooting here. Who's involved? Are you involved? Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of excitement here in Boston. We get a good fair share of film production here in Boston, but, you know, we're not New York, we're not Los Angeles. So it's still a very exciting thing when a new project comes to town. Talk to me about your experience working in Boston. What was it like? And have you done it before?
This is the first major production that I've shot in Boston. I've done some commercial work in the past and other smaller projects many, many years ago. So it was my first opportunity to actually work on a fairly big production in the city and surrounding area, actually.
Yeah.
And I must say that it was one of the most positive experiences that I've ever had in production.
Really?
I mean,
that's great to hear. I love that. Absolutely.
No, it was from every single level. The quality of the local talent is phenomenal. My own crew was definitely one of the best crews I've ever worked with, pound for pound, in terms of quality of talent and quality of personality.
So for post-production, did you do your entire post-production in Boston, or were you just doing dailies, or what was the relationship like?
We did our dailies post-production in Boston at Finish.
Mm-hmm.
Rob Bissett was our daily colorist.
Rob Bissett. We love Rob Bissett.
Yeah,
he's been on the show multiple times. He's an absolutely fantastic colorist. So you were in good hands, as you know.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. He was very detailed, very, very consistent, which is absolutely important in the process. You need that consistency, and you need that extra sharp eye to to make sure things are consistent, that's being captured on set, any anomalies that we should be concerned about with, a new lens that we might be using. He was all over that, and but also, really um, careful to emulate as much as we could the look that we're establishing on set, with the LUTs that we were using.
Let's talk about that look, because you were filming in Boston. It takes place in Boston. And Boston is represented Boston sort of has this representation in film that I see a lot, where it's kind of bluer tones. It's darker, it's grittier, not that saturated. And I feel like Defending Jacob does a really good job of sort of supporting that, that theme of what Boston looks like cinematically. But you sort of gave it a little bit more of a slicker sort of feel to it. It's not as gritty as some of the other films that have been shot here in Boston. I feel like you've sort of taken what audiences understand as East Coast cities and gave it something unique. And I'd love to talk to you about that. Maybe we can start just at visual references. What were you using for Defending Jacob to support and inspire your visuals?
Yes, so at the very, very beginning of our pre-production, Morton had a few film references that he wanted us, to discuss and certainly examine. And part of that was for the visual look of the film, and part of that was also the visual language of the film, in the sense, the difference of being the look being more in terms of lighting and contrast, and the language being really the language of the camera and how it would capture point of view, etc. So some of the choices that some of the films that Morton felt were great influences were Michael Clayton for probably more for the language. That is, the way in which a lens would be. I won't go into detail yet. So,
well, I'm curious the distinction. So you said the visual language versus
the visual tone, I guess.
Okay. So what is the distinction between the two?
It's just me being fancy, but basically it's just me trying to articulate the difference, not difference, but the separation between a look and which I would tend to say is more related to the way something will literally look, as
sure.
In terms of color and contrast, tone or tonality, and that often is going to be presented through the lighting and, of course, all the color palettes that the art department and costume bring to the table. The language is more, in my mind, is more about how you're telling the story, which that can be done through the kinds of shot making you design, the choices of lenses, the format that you shoot in, all those things. So we don't really separate the two. They're kind of it's a subsection of the same thing ultimately. But so the films that we referenced was Mystic River, Michael Clayton, a number of others. And in fact, it was funny in the process. There were many more films we referenced actually, and we read through the entire 8 scripts, and the process was we literally read from the very beginning, scene 1, episode 1, and discussed every single scene in detail. Sometimes not getting shot specific, and sometimes getting very shot specific. And tonally, we would occasionally, if our deal was if Morton or myself made a film reference, then we'd have to immediately stop and take a look Google a scene from a certain movie, and then we'd watch it. So it was
wow, like right as it was happening.
Right as it was happening. It was sort of like a okay, let's stop, let's watch this together. And actually, somehow it was really great. It really sort of kind of broke up the formalism of and the challenge of going through all 8 hours straight through, kind of dry, and also, of course, sparked other ideas that would be either translatable to other scenes or in other episodes as well. And then eventually we would build up a consistent list of motifs, visual motifs that seemed to feel right for us. The way Morton wanted to kind of present this in some ways is almost more like a Nordic thriller. And so it was really, so on top of having the tonal sense of a northeastern winter, we kind of took that, but also there was a balance between realism and so-called gritty feel to the film. We didn't want it to necessarily feel gritty for gritty's sake, and also the story that we're telling isn't really. There's sections of it, of course, that are gritty, but to apply a grittiness to a suburban part of Boston doesn't make any sense. So the grittiness, if it comes out, is going to mostly be through performances and the fact that a performance is captured almost exclusively in a very tight close-up. Part of the visual language that I spoke about, we decided to have, one of our motifs was basically to make sure that the camera always was from someone's point of view. Most of the time it was through Andy's character, but actually when the scene played, when it was important for the scene to play through Laurie's eyes, then we would kind of make sure that the camera was more physically, literally with Laurie, and be close with her, shoot over her shoulder to get the perspective of her looking at her son Jacob, for example. And one thing that was very important for Morton, and I think he really was very successful at it, is he wanted to create an enigma for Jacob, so that the point of view idea, the point of view perspective of being with Andy or with Laurie, just only emphasized Jacob's enigma for us not actually diving into his point of view, except for the occasional time. And that, we would hope, created a bit more of a mystery to him. And I think in that sense, I think we were somewhat successful.
Now, there's a lot of dark cinematography in Defending Jacob, and you see a lot of it now. I think over the past few years, a lot of cinematographers have really embraced this darkness and have been celebrated for it, because for a while we weren't seeing such great exposure and texture and just like tone in those blacks. And now people are able to do it. We've got the cameras that are able to do it, and you're seeing a lot of it. But I think Defending Jacob kind of has a unique approach to shooting dark cinematography. And I'd like to talk to you about a specific shot in episode 1 where Andy discovers a knife in Jacob's room. Talk to us about the way you approached that shot, because it was extraordinarily dark, but it had something different about it.
Yeah, so the spoiler alert, There's a scene at the very end of the episode 1 where Andy comes into his son's room and discovers a knife, and for that, it was sort of the start of one part of our storytelling, which is sort of to tell a bit of a thriller side to the main story that we're telling. The parameters for the scene were, of course, that it naturally should be dark, somewhat dark, but it should also be somewhat realistic, and yet it needs to be just to make it a little bit more of a thriller style. We need to amplify it in the lighting somewhat. So it's that fine line of talking about you start from realism or naturalism, I should say.
Sure.
And then you kind of amp up the expressionism, if you will. So it's, again, one of my more lame attempts at intellectualistic cinematography is, Vittorio Storaro, who's my hero, is excelled at that. He would take naturalistic light, and all the properties of that light were completely realistic. So you would take a Tuscan sunset, and he would, the hard light would be really quite warm, and the cool light would be cool, just the way it would be in a real sunset situation. And those tonalities would work together, but instead of, he would actually amplify the saturation of both colors, for example, and that's a way for him to amplify sort of what I call naturalistic expressionism, or expressionistic naturalism, whatever way you want to take it.
So you're talking about like in the darkness, finding where the light lands and giving that light extra saturation, extra boost. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's what I'm saying about what Storaro did so wonderfully. In this case, it was more about, for example, I had to decide, okay, what is the light source for the scene?
Yeah.
And there's, a number of ways you can do it. You can kind of light it subtly and have a very underexposed, soft light, but it gets murky and you lose detail, in the faces, and you lose detail on where you want the audience's eyes to go to.
Mm-hmm.
So, the other approach I took was, in normal settings, in somewhat urban settings, you're going to have artificial light coming through the window. So, I established street lighting on the night exteriors that would then justify the light source for the scene, which is basically a street lamp that is actually casting up towards Jacob's bedroom to suggest that it's actually on the second floor.
Okay.
So all the light is actually scraping up towards the ceiling and bouncing around the walls, and it's not actually lighting, the actors directly, except for when Andy's character walks through the light. So certainly, definitely borders more on sort of an expressionistic style at that point, but it felt correct for the scene. Plus, there was a choice to amplify the mercury vapor lighting. So in other words, that we weren't getting into blue moonlight,
sure,
we weren't getting into sodium vapor, but we just kind of wanted to keep the coolness going, we just kind of basically pushed it towards the cyan green.
And I love that choice. It looks awesome. And a really good use of, like I said before, it's a great use of dark cinematography, but kind of giving it your twist. And it's interesting to hear where the inspiration came from. I love that kind of stuff. Now, to achieve this, you also need the right camera and lenses. So can you talk to us about the camera and lens package that you chose for Defending Jacob?
We both, after talking through our references and inspirations, really felt that one of the most important aspects of the look, which is part of, in terms of lighting and contrast, also equally important is the glass that you use, the lenses.
Of course.
And so, because a lot of our visual language would be a lot of close-ups of our main characters, being with our characters, holding on a close-up while things are happening in the background, and even if the character is not speaking, we are staying with that character. Those kind of choices.
Yeah.
That aesthetic, we wanted to make sure that their world around them had a certain quality to it, and we both love anamorphic, and anamorphic lenses, of course, produce a very specific effect especially when you shoot close-ups on them, mm-hmm. and they sort of distort the background, and it has a very particular feel to it. Plus, a lot of the references that we were using were films that were shot anamorphically, so it felt natural that we would like to proceed with that.
Yes, anamorphic lenses is going to give you that really great look, but what camera are you pairing it with?
So we ended up shooting with the Panavision's XL2, which is a very good camera.
I've been hearing a lot of cinematographers coming on and talking more and more about using that Panavision camera. And certainly a ton of people are shooting with the Alexas. I hear, quite a bit about the Venice here and there. But this Panavision camera seems to be what I'm hearing a lot of for people that are shooting anamorphic.
Yeah, part of that is based on... first of all, it's an excellent camera, but also is one of the few cameras that can meet sort of the ideal criteria that Apple prefers for capturing their productions.
And what is that?
It's basically it basically requires 4K, but it's also equally important how the pixels work. So basically, when you shoot anamorphic, essentially what happens is you're going to unsqueeze the pixels. So when you unsqueeze the pixels, that creates a number that evaluates how much quality you may be potentially losing if you shoot, say, at a smaller level, like 3.2K. Or even a 4K sensor. So it's really important for Apple and for a number of other companies that they want to retain for the future is the highest resolution as they can. So the DxO2 was actually the camera that Apple was comfortable with shooting to capture anamorphic imagery when it's finalized. Yeah,
we had Michael Giolakis on talking about his work on Servant for Apple TV Plus. Mm-hmm. Same thing. I didn't know, and maybe I'm just forgetting, but I didn't know that was a requirement. But I know that he ended up, eventually using that.
Yeah, it's actually Netflix was, I think, the first company to really go forward and say, the importance of for essentially the future, that there had to be a certain high standard of resolution. So they had a mandate that required all their productions shoot 4K. That's why in the end they often use the Red, which has a higher resolution capacity than the Alexa. That said, to be fair, the Alexa still, even at a lower resolution, produced a very, very beautiful image. I personally love the Alexa. At any resolution, I'll take it. But it's in the end, you are delivering a product, and the product has to meet the standards of the people who are paying for it. So those are the standards that were set for Netflix in the earlier years, and Apple has a certain standard as well that they'd like to maintain. And the most important thing for us was to deliver that, but also artistically be able to shoot what we felt was the right tools to tell the story. And in this case, it was anamorphic lenses. So once we got all the numbers correct and made sure that everything corresponded, it seemed that the XL2 was the best camera for this project.
Kashyap Chaganti on Instagram wants to know the color science involved in creating the show's kind of bluish look.
So on set, I would work with Nick, our DIT colorist, and we would make subtle adjustments based on some initial LUTs that we established in testing before we started production, and those LUTs would then be sent to Rob at finish and applied as closely as possible, because Rob would be in a room where he could see even more detail than what we're seeing on set. He would make appropriate adjustments. For example, if something was a little too contrasty or a little too dark, he might bring something up, as long as the tone felt right, or the opposite being true, where if something felt too bright or too flat, he would then make those adjustments based on the aesthetic that we generally establish. So, but it was amazingly consistently there. It's actually, it's kind of rare that I've had an experience where what I see on set is delivered in the dailies, and ultimately, in the final color, which we did in Los Angeles, was closely matched because we really loved the look that we established in production.
In our last few minutes, I want to talk about your experience on Game of Thrones. How many episodes did you shoot?
Yeah, so I started on season 2. Basically stayed till the end of the final season. So, but I would. It was obviously a great experience. And the difference with Game of Thrones versus almost any other kind of experience I've had is that we had a quite complicated kind of production where we would, but it was also great because if we had 10 episodes in a season, often that was broken up to 2 episodes per for a director. So there would be like 5 directors doing 10 episodes. Often those episodes would be clumped together. So one director would be shooting episode 1 and 2, the other 3 and 4, 5, 6.
And weren't they happening at the same time too?
Well, there was overlap. So what would happen is that you'd have those directors prepping. Obviously the first one's prep for a certain time, and then they start shooting. And when the first 2 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, start shooting, the next block would come in, a director, and start prepping their stuff. And sometimes they would actually have two other directors prepping. The key thing that was beyond this overlap, what was really critical, were multiple things, I guess. One is that each director had their own cinematographer and their own first AD. And they would stay as a unit. And they would prep their episodes as a unit. They would fly to different locations to scout the locations. They would shop plan. They would, I would build equipment lists. The AD would organize the extras and everything else. And basically, it was as if you were shooting a movie onto yourself. So, and because the way it was structured, there were 2 units shooting simultaneously. So you had one large unit in Belfast that would shoot a lot of the interior sets and whatnot, and some Northern Ireland locations. And then the other unit was the travel unit that would go to different places like Spain and Iceland and Croatia and many other places as well. And those 2 units would run simultaneously. So the biggest task was to organize everything, which was done brilliantly by our producers, Bernie Caulfield and Chris Newman. And basically have the actors and these teams of directors hopscotch between the two units all the way through. And what would naturally happen is, the first two director units would be shooting for X number of weeks, and then they would have to stop, because of the scheduling, the new director units would come in to shoot a certain location or a certain set to fill it in. That would give them the first directors unit directors. The first directors to have an actual stop time to prep some more for their episode. So what ultimately would happen is we would end up getting more production. We would end up getting more prep time than you would normally for regular television.
So even with the overlap, you're still getting more prep time.
Yes, it was naturally built in because the locations and or sets some of them had to be shot out by a certain period of time. You'd have to naturally have an overlap. So it allowed for the team, the nucleus of the director, cinematographer, and AD for each of those blocked episodes to be extremely well prepped, so that when they landed on set, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what equipment they needed. So we never had more equipment than we needed, just sitting there not doing anything. Well, sometimes we did, but that was just the excess of a complicated factor of trying to rig pre-light everything. But ultimately, it really allowed us to be very, very focused on a 10-hour day, which is all we had. We never did overtime, pretty much.
Wow.
So,
how the hell did you get that show done in 10-hour days?
Well, great crew, first of all, a really phenomenal crew. It was sort of more European style, where you essentially shoot 10 hours straight. You get a walking lunch. It's such a much more efficient way of working.
Europeans don't want to have a nice lunch?
Yeah, believe it or not, some of them do.
Jesus, I figured that there would be breaks along the way, casual, you're smoking a cigarette, you get some coffee.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, I mean, sometimes in Italy or France, you definitely have a bit of that, but also the converse is, of course, that, you end up shooting 10 hours and you go home at 6 p.m. You can then have a fantastic dinner
with
your family and friends, and you get a good night's sleep, and you start fresh again at 8 o'clock the next morning, and you're never dog tired.
I love that.
It's so much better of a system. I wish we would adapt it here in the United States. That's
a great system. I mean, honestly, even lunch breaks on commercials, I mean, you'll get 45 minutes or an hour or whatever, but once you're done eating, you're kind of like, okay, let's start working again. There's really no reason to delay, because everybody just wants to wrap up and get the hell out of there.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was really, it's that actually, ironically, it was the shorter hours that made it work, because otherwise, as a crew, as a production, we would suffer greatly.
Yeah.
And it was actually another key component of I think why we were, at least on a production level, successful.
Can you talk to us about one of your favorite scenes that you worked on in Game of Thrones? Maybe something that was extraordinarily challenging or rewarding in some way. Something that you can just give us a little bit of insight into how you shot it and why you loved it.
Yeah, I'm split between two. One is a penultimate episode where in season 7, where Daenerys lands on an ice lake where our heroes are stranded, and the Night King is battling them, and it's fairly complex shooting to shoot in an exterior location in Belfast in winter, trying to control the light so that it felt like it was always magic hour. And then the other would be, I guess, the finale, which in the season 8 brought we had the opportunity to use new technologies to really plan our shooting. One being particularly essentially a virtual reality system that allowed us to basically pre-plan, almost pre-visualize the sequences in the episode, where we were using partially virtual sets a lot of the times. And that just saved so much time and imagination. And, it was a great experience. Basically, we would use a VR system, which is similar to a gaming system. We would put in the models of the sets that were planned, and myself or the directors would be able to walk around, literally like scouting a real location, and find our angles. And if we felt like we needed something changed, like in one case, the throne room, where we were actually taking the original throne room and we were going to cut it up. So we started to play with the silhouette, and I would go back to our designer and discuss, what opportunities we might have if we did this or that, and if we moved a wall a little bit more this way, so we were able to really, really explore all options.
So you were involved in the construction of the virtual set as well. We had Caleb Deschanel on Go Creative Show talking about The Lion King and how they, did the virtual filmmaking for that. And it was pretty wild because they were kind of just in this small space, relatively small, but they had a camera that had the exact same functionality that a traditional camera would have, except it was all virtual. So you'd still have a focus. You'd still, they weren't using zoom lenses, but you know what I mean. And they had to scale the set in a way that, a foot would be 5 feet or whatever the scale was. I don't remember at this moment. For those of you that are interested, you can check through our archives. We did it in July of 2019, last year. And that was an interesting workflow to talk about. What was it like on Game of Thrones? Was it similar, where you were kind of in just a void, wearing VR goggles and getting to experience the set that way?
It was that, although, in our case, it was literally like 2 fold-out desks and 2 technicians who were brilliant at building model work, 3D model work within basically, software that's similar to, gaming and architectural design, I guess.
Yeah.
So we could at real time, well, not real time, I would go through a space, or the directors would, and we would find our angles. And if we wanted to make some changes, we'd first talk to the designer to make sure that Deb Riley, who was our designer, make sure that she agreed with them. And then we would redesign the sets somewhat to work with, the storytelling we're trying to make. One very simple thing that was really kind of very, very important, and we may have not known until we actually were there, was another scene where Daenerys is making a big speech to her army. That was almost a virtual set. The only component was the steps that she was standing on, and even that was only half the steps. So we had some concept work, beautiful work that was done by the art department, that that we wanted to inspire these certain angles, shots looking over her shoulder to her army. But we realized that the initial set of steps that we were going to build with the camera at the height that we think was the angle we wanted, we realized that the steps were actually not high enough, that we actually had to build twice the amount of steps. So instead of actually building the same twice the amount of steps, we just digitally extended them. But we only found that out through using the virtual reality.
Wow.
So, it would have been not impossible, and we probably would have learned that lesson in the pre-visualization stage. But what this allowed us was to essentially storyboard, if you will, or photo board the sequence without going through the storyboard process. And I love the storyboard process, but when you're trying to create a sequence where the only reference you have is maybe some concept art and some, elevation drawings, you have to imagine quite a bit to understand what you might be able to capture. And yet there's a lot of things that could be lost in translation. By having a 3D model, and in this case, we actually, went a little bit more elaborate, probably a little bit too much. I added snow and fire and smoke and, thousands of extras that made the whole thing very slow because of all the amount of processing the software had to do just to get the image. But it also helped create an atmosphere and a mood for it. And so we were able to create that, photoboard it, create it, and sometimes animate the camera even. So I made essentially some passes where I made what's called an animatic, which is essentially an animated storyboard.
Yeah.
That was the basis for the previs. And because the virtual reality software was tied into the previs software, it made the previs time for finding the shots and developing the shots exceedingly faster. We probably saved literally weeks. Well, we did. We saved at least 4 to 6 weeks of work between storyboarding and previs work.
God, what an experience that must have been working on game. I mean, it's such a massive show. Were you involved in the the now infamous Starbucks Cup episode?
I was not.
What happened?
However, I think I was actually there in the moment it might have happened, but I did not have a coffee in my hand. It is one of those things where, what can you say? I mean, maybe it's appropriate, that we think we're infallible and obviously we're not. And, there's a lot of eyes on a lot of things, a lot of detail, and sometimes the tree lands on you when you're not looking, the one that's behind you. So, I don't, I think it's extraordinary, but of course, I think knowing how hard everyone worked, sure, we did the 10 hours, but the amount of dedication that everyone made, the sacrifices, especially our local crew, our electricians that would jump from one set to the other would literally, some of these people would be working on the weekends, not seeing their family, just to make sure that we had a lit set on the Monday morning, and the amount of dedication and pride that we all took. It's an unfortunate little.
It's hilarious though. Like it's funny. Like, well, how did people react? Did people go crazy? And was it like heads will roll for this, or are people just like, oh my God? It's such a ridiculous mistake that's hilarious at the same time, and there's nothing you can do. It is what it is. I mean, what was the reaction in the Game of Thrones family when this happened?
I don't know. I think everyone had their own sort of reaction. I think obviously we weren't happy about it, but we weren't. We also realizing, what the heck, whatever. We knew the amount of work we did, and that was sort of a demonstration, I guess, of how maybe potentially exhausted we might have all been in terms of not seeing the forest for the trees or whatever the expression is. But, so it was maybe in some ways reflective of actually how damn hard everyone worked.
Did it get traced back to anybody?
No, I don't think it did.
Somebody out there knows the culprit. There's got to be, because there has to be a name on that cup. You'd think somewhere on somebody. Certainly in the pre-COVID days, even then, I think we had names on cups, but luckily it wasn't even a Starbucks cup, by the way. So just for the record, for Starbucks, whether they like the promotion or not. It wasn't.
No, it was just a regular paper cup.
Oh, that's funny. I thought it was a Starbucks cup. Well, there you go. That just goes to show you how.
I could be wrong. I actually could be wrong, but it's good. I must say I haven't really pulled that image up so recently, so maybe I'm wrong. But all that said, I think it's
I mean, I guess it's a coffee cup. It could be a Starbucks cup. It may not be. I guess it's you just don't know. But oh my God, that is so funny. I haven't looked at this in such a long time. And everybody listens like that. All right, that's old news. Yes, I know. But this is just a funny. This is the first time we've had someone on from Game of Thrones since the scandal. And oh my God, that is just so funny. When you think about all the hands this passes, and
oh yeah,
I love this.
I mean, I know. I mean, look. I mean, everyone from the moment we shot it all the way through to the very, very final, quality control. Obviously, it's there. I maybe, and again, all I can think is that maybe at some late stage, some people that were watching it were wondering, okay, well, I guess they'll fix that. Everyone says, we'll fix that. They'll fix that.
Oh, my God.
But anyway, I guess it is.
I hope they never do fix it. Just leave it in. This is part of cinematic history now. Who cares? I mean, I think leave it in.
They should do that. They should do a re-release with the coffee cup version.
Absolutely. Jonathan Freeman ASC, thank you so much for coming on the Go Creative Show podcast. Of course, you can find Jonathan at freemandp.com, FREEMANDP.com. You can check out his work there. And it's essentially his reel, but it'll let you know what he's worked on. And then you can go check out his work. You'll be amazed at how much of it you've already seen and didn't even know he was behind the camera. Jonathan, thank you so much for being on Go Creative Show. And we'll have to have you back for your next project.
I really appreciate it, Ben. Thank you so much.
I want to thank Jonathan Freeman for coming on the show and talking about his experience on all sorts of shows, right? Of course, Game of Thrones, Defending Jacob, and sharing his experiences with us. We love that. We also love Matt Russell because he mixes and masters and makes the show sound so good. You can find him at gainstructure.com, at gainstructure on Twitter. And of course, our producer, Connor Crosby, you can find him at ignitionvisuals.com. But really, the best place to go is gocreativeshow.com because then you have access to all of it. The notes from today's episode, links to all the things we talked about, and all previous episodes. Plus, all the different places we've got accounts so that you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of it. And of course, we encourage feedback. So please let us know what you think of the show, if you have any guest suggestions, and if you have any questions for upcoming guests. I want to thank MZ, Education for Creatives, for supporting the show today. And of course, all of you guys for listening. Without all of your support, the show would not happen. So thank you so much. We'll see you next week on another episode of Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.